I'm Liz Vogel. I'm the CEO of Jewish Family Service, and I just want to thank you so much for joining us. I think the easiest part of today's conversation is a little bit of housekeeping. So for people in the room, bathrooms are down the hall behind me on your left. There's snacks and water in the corner. And if you're on Zoom or in person, we are recording. So your faces aren't and your names aren't showing, but after the presentation, there's a Q&A, and we're going to open it up if you want to ask things in person, if you want to ask things via chat. And for that, if you're not comfortable having your name out there or your face out there, you can turn your camera off, and you can just use some initials or change your name. If you're not familiar with Zoom, how to do that. If you scroll in your picture, there's 3 dots and you click on that and they'll let you change your name. So you can have privacy that way. We're hosting this today because it feels like the very least we could do, frankly, in a very, very difficult, trying time. If you don't know Jewish Family Service, Jewish is in our name, it's in our values. Half of our clients are not Jewish, and a lot of my coworkers here are not Jewish either. It's an agency that's here for the community, and some of the work we've done in the past involves helping people resettle from what were former Soviet nations, Soviet countries. And many people in this region are here today because we helped their parents, their grandparents, or them directly to come here. And we still work very closely with over 200 people who came here later in life, and learning English wasn't always so easy, and culturally maybe this community didn't feel at home from day one. And so we have a very cohesive Russian-speaking culture center with over 200 participants today. And so when this situation started to happen in Ukraine, on a Wednesday night, I think everyone on this call knows that while we were asleep, bombs started dropping in Ukraine. And I woke up Thursday morning and called my coworkers who I thought might be impacted, and then started to hear directly from them what they were facing as individuals and what their loved ones are facing who are still in the region. And so one thing we're learning is the complexity, which many of you on this call already know, of navigating our immigration law. And there are a lot of different choices to be made about how people come here and under what status that will have long-term implications. So this is a starting point for us. We want to do what we can to help you and help your loved ones. I know many people want to reunite with family members who are caught up in this conflict. And then we've also heard that many people people with relatives in the region, those relatives want to stay, or they want to go home again when this ends. As soon as they can, they want to go back. So diverse, complex challenges that are in front of people, and we need a really smart, strong team to help us figure that out. And that's the team at the Immigrant and Refugee Law Center. And they are with us today to give us an overview. So quick presentation, and open up the floor to questions so you can get some free legal advice from them and start to consider, different ways of approaching this. So with that, it's my honor. First, I want to say thank you to both Julie and to Alex for coming in today. And I'm going to hand off to Julie Leftwich, who's the Executive Director of the Immigrant and Refugee Law Center. So thank you. We're having a little audio. The favorite words in the Zoom universe is you're on mute. So we're working on the mute button, and then Julie will be right with us.
Oh, okay.
Here we go. I think we've got her.
Sorry about that. So starting again, As Liz mentioned, I'm Julie Leftwich. I'm the founder and executive director of the Immigrant and Refugee Law Center. And I'm really just here to give a brief intro before I pass it over to Alex. But we started IRLC 4 years ago to really fill a community need for accessible immigration legal services in the greater Cincinnati area, as initially identified through the Cincinnati Public Schools, though we quickly began working with families in the broader community as well. We offer pro bono legal services to low-income immigrant and refugee families, and we are increasingly helping local families who are dealing with crises and have loved ones, for instance, in Afghanistan, of course, now in Ukraine. We're very happy to be developing a close partnership with Jewish Family Services. While it's really devastating to see that once again we have refugees from our community fleeing Europe, having grown up in the Jewish community here in Cincinnati, I'm really happy that we're able to be here to offer guidance and to help answer the many questions that I'm sure that you all have. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Alexandria Lubens-Otto, who is our managing attorney. She has been practicing for many years in immigration law and is going to cover some of the legal options that might be applicable in these situations.
Thank you, Julie. Can everyone hear me? Great. My name is Alexandria Lubens-Otto, and I am managing attorney with the Immigrant and Refugee Law Center. I am an immigration attorney who's been practicing in that area of law for 10 to 15 years, somewhere in that range. And I'm happy to speak to you today about this issue. We at IRLC have been, over the last few years, have become very accustomed to crises in different parts of the world, leading to some changes and increases in our client population and the need for us to do outreach to different communities to help explain what the immigration law offers in the United States offers to those communities. So I'm happy to speak to you today about this group. This would be Ukrainians who are under dire threat at this time. What we're going to be talking about today is asylum in the United States, as well as some other types of immigration relief, as we refer to it. So asylum in the United States begins with an application. It is called an I-589 application, and it covers asylum, something called withholding of removal, and protection under the Convention Against Torture, or CAT. They are all three on the same application. It is primarily for asylum, but withholding of removal, think of it as another form of asylum, but without all of the benefits that you would receive if granted asylum. And the same with protection under the Convention Against Torture, similar to asylum, but without all the benefits. The primary difference is that withholding of removal and protection under the Convention Against Torture are both considered temporary forms of relief. At some point, the US government could decide that you no longer need the status of withholding of removal or protection under CAT and can begin the process to return you to your home country. But asylum, once granted, is permanent and is a pathway to lawful permanent residency in the United States. So defensive asylum. There are two different types of asylum in this country. There's affirmative asylum and there is defensive asylum. Affirmative asylum is the traditional asylum, what most people might be familiar with. Somebody is in the United States and submits an application to an asylum officer claiming that they are no longer able to return to their home country safely. But there are some people who have to file for defensive asylum. And really the only difference here is affirmative asylum is to an asylum office. Defense of asylum is to an immigration court. You are using asylum as a defense to deportation. You are in proceedings. So how do you end up in defensive asylum rather than affirmative asylum? The first way is what many of you have seen on the news. You come in through a border without permission. So you'll see on the news a lot of people coming from what has been Central America typically, but more and more we are receiving clients at IRLC who have come in through the border from the African continent. We know that Ukrainian nationals are coming in. Other parts of the world are choosing to enter through that border. They enter without permission or entering without inspection. And you're saying, well, they stop there and they check in, so isn't that the same thing? No. Entering with inspection means you had a visa to present and to be inspected, stamped, and you're processed in. So think of a tourist visa that allows you to fly into the United States. When you enter without permission that you received in advance, such as a visa to come to this country, you are entering, some people would say illegally. By the way, that's a B misdemeanor, so it's not a major offense to do that, but you're entering without that pre-approved permission and you are processed. Many people are detained at our southern border. Some are detained at our northern borders, but mostly the southern border. And then you are released into the United States, and that is called being paroled into the United States. And you are released with explicit instructions that you are to proceed to an immigration court where you will present your case to an immigration judge and will argue against a prosecutor for the Department of Homeland Security. And that is where the need for immigration attorneys is most felt. And that is something that IRLC does. We represent individuals in the immigration courts. Could we go back to that? Just, I want to make sure. The referral from an asylum office, that is, you have applied for affirmative asylum and you've met with the asylum officer in an interview, but the asylum officer has chosen not to approve your application and is referring you now to the immigration court. So yes, you get a second bite at the apple, but now you're in defensive mode. And that will eventually lead to what is called a merits hearing. That is the final hearing where the immigration judge will make a decision on your case. If approved, you become an asylee and you're on the pathway to lawful permanent residency. If you are denied, you are ordered deported and you have 30 days to leave the United States or file an appeal of that decision, right? Temporary protected status, this was very recently extended to Ukrainians who were in the United States by March the 15th of 2022. So if someone entered the United States after that date, they're from Ukraine or any of the other countries that have TPS, they are ineligible to apply for temporary protected status. TPS is temporary. It is like asylum. It is clearly the US government stating conditions in your home country are unacceptable, inhumane, and because of that, we want you to have some protection and be able to stay here for a certain amount of time. I believe this is for 18 months. It might be 2 years, but I think it's 18 months. That can be extended. And in fact, temporary protected status gets extended all the time. In fact, I believe the temporary protected status that was issued for Honduras has been extended for 20 years now. I mean, it keeps going depending on the need. Can you apply for both TPS and asylum? You may. Why would you do that? Well, it's a safety net. So you have to look at it that nothing is guaranteed when you apply for asylum. It is a very difficult process. It is very hard to win your case. In the immigration courts, the denial rate across the country is somewhere around 80%. Different courts have different rates. There are some courts that have almost 100% denial rates. But I would say the Cleveland court, its average was lowered a little bit by the addition of a more flexible judge, but really prior to that, about 85%, 90% denial rate in the Cleveland Immigration Court. So you would want to apply for temporary protected status to have sort of that safety net in place so that should you lose your case and you're not able to appeal, you have something that allows you to remain and most importantly, work. You get a temporary work authorization with both asylum and with temporary protected status. So you would apply for asylum, make sure you get your work authorization through that. And then if that fails, if that doesn't work for you and TPS is still in place, then you could switch over with the understanding that at some point, it's possible that you would be told you can return and the process, the court process begins again, right? So you are able to present a case to the immigration judge. So family-based petitions is another form of relief. Again, IRLC, we cover all forms of immigration with the exception of employment-based immigration, although we've had a couple of cases. For the most part, when we're talking about family-based, we're saying there's an immediate relative of either a lawful permanent resident of the United States, that's a green card holder, or a US citizen. And that relative, the US citizen or the LPR, wants to bring that relative or relatives into the United States and have them obtain the status of lawful permanent residency or green card holders. So what is an immediate relative? For purposes of what we call an I-130 application, an immediate relative is a parent, child, or spouse of a US citizen or a lawful permanent resident. That being said, you can still, there are applications available for US citizens to petition for siblings. And also when you're talking about children, we're mindful that they are typically under 21, unmarried. A lawful permanent resident can petition for a child under 21. A US citizen can petition for a child of under 21, over 21, and even a married child. So when you're talking about immediate relative, though, we think in terms most traditionally parent, spouse, child, right? Once you submit the application for this relative, the I-130 application, the goal of that is to prove what are called the bona fides of that relationship. It is, as you can imagine, more is required when you are talking about marriage. But you're submitting this proof that you have the right to petition, they have the right to be petitioned for. Here's the evidence of that relationship, it is legitimate. And that is all resolved by USCIS. USCIS is our immigration services. They took over what was formerly known as INS, which a lot of us were familiar with. USCIS approves the application, and when that's done, it now moves to the National Visa Center, which is our State Department, and proceeds to consular processing, right? So this is for when you're talking about a family-based petition, you have the LPR US citizen who wants to submit the petition here in the United States, and typically the relative is outside of the United States. There are some exceptions where you can do what's called adjustment of status and petition for someone who is already here. But primarily, for purposes of this conversation today, we are talking about a petition for somebody in another country who will go through a US embassy. Okay. That is an overview, and I know it's rather brief, on the types of relief that we are typically looking at in a crisis situation, similar to what is happening in Ukraine, what has happened recently in Afghanistan, what is ongoing in Sudan, Haiti, and other parts of the world. I do want to quickly let you know what asylum is in the United States, just give you an idea of what it is they're looking for. In order to apply for asylum, on that application and with the supporting evidence you send in, you are showing that you have been persecuted, suffered harm in your home country, and it is more likely than not that you will suffer future persecution. And the persecution is related to one of 5 grounds only. It is based on your politics, your religion, your race, your nationality, or your membership in what is called a particular social group. This is what we call a nexus, that nexus of persecution and protected ground, religion, politics, race, nationality, membership in a particular social group, that must exist. And it is up to the applicant to prove that it exists in order to even apply for asylum, but certainly in order to be successful. The difference between an asylee and a refugee is determined outside of the country. Refugee designation is granted outside of the country, usually through the United Nations, but you'll see it in displaced persons camp, as I call them, or refugee camps. So that designation exists before they enter the United States. An asylee, that's determined through the asylum office or the immigration court. I guess we'll open it up for some questions.
I'm going to turn on one of your mics so that if someone online has a
Okay.
question.
So we're opening up for questions. If you want to use the chat button or if you want to speak up.
You one at the back?
Does the government put limitations on how many people would be in any given year, say granted asylum or granted certain types of visas for immigrants? Do you want to repeat the question?
Yes. So the question was, does the US government put any type of cap or limitation on the number of individuals who would be granted refugee, asylee, or other maybe family-based petitions in the United States? They do, and for certain applications. Refugees, as far as how many the US will allow in from any given area or region, there are limitations on that. The last time that was open would have been in the late 40s, early 50s under the Displaced Persons Act. That's how my father came in with his family from Latvia. They might need it again soon. So since that time, there have been these limitations. There is no cap on the TPS or the temporary protected status because they've really kind of limited it by you had to be here before a certain date. Family-based petitions, they're quasi-limited. The best way to say that is they have them done by availability based on filing by a certain date. And so you'll see the more heavily, an embassy that's more heavily used for that, they tend to go back a little bit further. So it's not unusual to see some family-based petitions taking 5 years or more from a certain country because the demand is so high there.
We've got a question online from Lily.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My question is related to the relatives here who want to bring their family, let's say the son with his family, but they are holding just the green card. They are not citizens yet. Do you know approximately how long will take the application process?
So if a lawful permanent resident wishes to petition for an adult child over 21 who is married, they are not able to do that. They would have to be a US citizen in
Okay,
order to petition for that child. But let's say they were not married, and they were 20 years old. The petition process itself, getting the first part approved, is not the problem. That could go fairly quickly. That could be anywhere from 3 to 6 months and you would have approval. Where everything can slow down is in the consular processing. At this time, the US government is requesting that any petitions for family coming out of Ukraine, that they go through the US Embassy in Frankfurt, Germany. Why? To not overwhelm the US embassies in the Baltics, Poland, and those other nations that themselves are very close to being under threat, whether they're members of NATO or not. So if you are going to start routing applications through one primary embassy, that can cause some delays. Everyone that applies has to go through an interview, and they will go through what's called triple vetting through our security services. And they're doing that because we learned a lesson from this most recent evacuation from Afghanistan, where Islamabad and Pakistan became rapidly overwhelmed with all sorts of petitions, and I think Qatar as well. So they've already kept it in mind, knowing that we're dealing with millions and potentially millions of applications. So right now they're asking that it go through Frankfurt, and then I imagine other parts of Europe would be fine. Just those areas, those countries right in the region, I think they just can't send it through there without it being greatly delayed.
Okay, could I summarize? The answer is that the parents of the children who are in Ukraine right now, and the parents are not citizens, they are not able to file the application, right, for them?
Not for an adult married child.
Yes, okay. What about siblings? If the sibling is an American citizen?
Yes, they can file that application. Again, our embassy would not be processing that in Kiev. So the application itself, the I-130, typically that's for one person. Although I can say I have seen the application be approved for, say, someone's sibling, their wife and their children, as noted on that application, because you do have to report all of those relationships. And the I-130, that got approved, but then remember, they have to leave and they have to go elsewhere to go through the process. So yes, a US citizen may petition for their sibling in hopes that their sibling and any spouse and minor children they have would also receive the approval. But that approval is only on the I-130. The consular processing could be a completely different story.
So it might take some time.
It could be years. That's correct.
It could be years. Okay, thank you.
We have two questions, 3 questions in the chat. So,
Okay,
do you want me to read them, or do you want to?
I'll pull it up. So let me,
So Alex is pulling up the questions from the chat. Right now we have 3.
all right. So the first one I have is, can a conditional green card holder based on marriage apply for their mother? They can. It can slow things down when you're conditional, because there is this process to remove those. What that means is somebody who was married for less than 2 years before they applied for the green card. And there's this probationary period. But yes, they can. But I think that, you can do it. And then once those conditions are lifted, that information would be in the system. So it might take a little bit longer, but yes, it can be done. The next question says, this is not exactly related, but do you have info on how green card holders, in this case from Russia, may apply for and receive health insurance, either Obamacare, Medicaid? Lawful permanent residents are entitled to certain government benefits without going into huge detail. Not everything, but some of them, and it's a matter of applying and showing your identification, your lawful permanent residency. There was, for a stretch of time, sort of a penalty for using government assistance that has been lifted when it came time to for other members of the family to apply for their green card or naturalization. But so there are, a lawful permanent resident is entitled to certain benefits. So Social Security, food stamps, things like that. The next question I have is, I am a US citizen and have my father who fled to Germany about 1 week ago. I want to have him come to live with me in the US. I want to see what forms I need to fill out and to start the process. I was told the I-131 and 134. Okay, the I-131 that this individual is speaking about is for humanitarian parole. Humanitarian parole was much talked about during the Afghan crisis that we recently went through, which is this notion that this person doesn't have a visa or doesn't have a visa available to them right now. So I want them to be allowed to come into the US first and then apply for their status or their visa. That is rarely granted, rarely. We're not talking about Afghans who were brought in on humanitarian parole, decided by the Department of Defense, put on a plane and evacuated. We are talking about a consular process. So no, if this is your parent and you're a US citizen, you would be filling out an I-130 application first and foremost, establishing this is your parent, establishing you're a US citizen, the bona fides of that parent-child relationship, that you are over 21, because you have to be over 21 to petition for a parent. And then you might, once that's in the system and possibly at least one half of it has been approved, the I-130, you might want to submit an I-131 humanitarian parole application if there are reason to believe that there is a need for your parent to leave Germany. I doubt that's going to come up anytime soon. In all likelihood, you would submit this. The process would be done through, again, the embassy in Frankfurt, and your father would then be scheduled at some point for an interview at the consulate and processed in the traditional manner. Right?
So we're getting some questions about the time it takes.
I need to start with 130 form and
Are there any
wait
recommendations
for the response, right? I don't know if I need to mention that it's my father, and maybe I can be his sponsor. But
when you submit the I-131 for humanitarian parole, you are required to also submit something called an I-134 that shows the sponsorship that you can support this individual when they come in. Again, the I-131 and I-134 in the situation that you have described to me, you as a US citizen who I'm assuming is over 21 and a father who is already in Germany, I do not believe that is the proper process. I think you need to submit an I-130 application. And once the consular process begins, there is a different sponsorship form that you would use called an I-864, but I don't want to fill everybody's head with a bunch of numbers. Needless to say, the I-130 is more appropriate in this situation. Before I go on, for anyone who has questions about this, it is so important to speak with an immigration attorney. There are a lot of very well-meaning people, community advocates that absolutely, they want to do everything to help, but they oftentimes kind of hear about something and kind of throw it out there, and they end up advising people maybe to go in a direction that would be far more difficult than one that we as immigration attorneys with experience know would be proper and more efficient. So please, anytime you have that question, if something comes up later, that's what IRLC is here for. We're here to answer those questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Also, then we thank you for posting these questions. That we're done with that, or is that all the questions?
There are a couple of questions that.
Okay, there we go. All
Sorry.
right, the application process sounds very slow. Our relative needs help right now. She only wants to stay here temporarily and go back when it's safe. Is there no way to expedite a visa? No, there's no way to expedite a visa. Yes.
My question, how many applications are pending currently with the U.S. consulate in Frankfurt?
I have no idea. I imagine this, I just saw the notice for it, I would say 2 weeks ago, that everything needs to be routed through there. But, you know, people were working their way in. Did you receive any information on that? I would say that when they reroute it that way, imagine that hundreds of thousands.
Could I ask the question? My question is, because of the situation in Ukraine, is the Immigration Service issuing, let's say, guest visas for the Ukrainians who could come to their relatives for full support? Hello?
No, that would be a form of humanitarian parole. We don't have guest visas. You know, again, think of a visa as that advance permission, and the only way those are issued are through a U.S. embassy. So it isn't that you have USCIS, our immigration services here in the United States, has any control over what those U.S. embassies and consular processing is doing. They are parts of the whole.
Okay.
So there are no guest visas at this time. If there is an urgent need, and if someone is in Ukraine, they would have to exit Ukraine and go through a U.S. embassy after something has been filed with that U.S. embassy. I should say that when we're talking about something like asylum, and you brought up a good point, if you ask for asylum in the United States, you may not return to Ukraine. You can't get your green card and go back. There are some people who get citizenship eventually and then go back without consequence, but the US government has the power to intervene with that if they feel that if there was something fraudulent about the application.
Okay,
All
thank
right.
you.
So we see this question, my brother-in-law's wife crossed into Moldova.
Yes. My brother-in-law's wife crossed into Moldova is a password for minors required to cross into passport. I was wondering what that was. I was like, there's a password, I want to know it, to cross in the US. If no process was started, is there an option to apply for the asylum already here in the US? No. All right, so okay, is a passport required to cross in the US? Yes and no, but what is needed is a visa. Again, you may not enter, and most of us know this too, we can't go to many other countries without getting a visa in advance. So the US is big on visas, so you have to have permission, or if you show up at the border, you would, at the southern border, you flew into Mexico, and don't have a visa, you are in deportation proceedings and you can file for defensive asylum. You could also be detained for the full extension of your case. If you show up at the border, the US government has the power under our laws to detain you in a immigration detention facility until your case is finished.
Yes.
All right. And do they do that with children? They put them into a form of like youth shelter if they show up without anybody.
Um,
Asylum in the US, again, it depends on how you came in. You might apply for affirmative with the asylum office, or you would apply defensively.
No,
To
это
że
было
Ksenia
правительство,
говорили.
правительство. If we have time, could I ask you a specific question?
Go
Hello?
ahead. Yes, go ahead.
I have a friend who is in Belarus. She's an American citizen, and she would like to come back, you know, in these circumstances. But she worked in America only for 20 credit hours. She doesn't have 40. She's 76. Will she be eligible for any, you know, federal benefits here?
Did you say she was a US citizen?
She is a US citizen, yes.
Well, like any US citizen, she's eligible for I mean, when you're talking about the credit, that really doesn't necessarily apply. Once she becomes a US citizen, if she hasn't given up that citizenship, then she would be eligible like any other US citizen for certain benefits once she's back in the United States. But that would be she would have to take that up with the different, like the Social Security Department or something along those lines.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you.
Mhm. I see another question that says we are talking about migration and family reunion. It could take years. Is there any chance to get them refugee status sooner? Again, refugee status is determined outside of the country. The UNHCR, the United Nations, that they deal with refugees and helping with that determination. Other organizations may be involved with that as well. So whether or not they get that refugee status, please understand, once you get that refugee status, you may wait for a number of years in a camp or displaced persons camp or outside of a camp until you are given permission to enter a country. And there is no guarantee that that country will be the United States. As a refugee, you do not, after the Displaced Persons Act ended, you do not get to pick the United States. It is, you might get it, you might not.
Okay. Interesting.
You could go to Australia or something like that. I know they have, you know, a lot of open numbers there. My daughter, I think, did I already get this one? Okay, no, my daughter, her husband, and their baby son were evacuated to Romania. There any chance they would have to, so they're going to be going through the embassy in Romania. So it's the same thing. It's petitioning for them. Again, they would, you know, preference is family-based petitions to go through Frankfurt, but if, you know, somebody's in Romania and they are able to process through our consulate there, then that's where they would have to go. If that embassy closes or is not processing, then they have to process through another one. The good news is that, you know, that they're out. That's really the way the US government sort of looks at it. Like, we don't want to do anything that will circumvent the regular visa processing of an embassy, whether it's family-based petitions or otherwise. We want everything to work within the rules and the system. So when we're talking about that type of processing, keep that in mind, that they really don't want to go around that. There was a lot of push for that during the Afghan situation because of the way it was handled, and the US government has learned its lesson from that. They really want to stick to the rules. Hello, my question is the following. My parents are on occupied by Russia territory right now, and the only way for them to leave the country would be by moving to a Russian city and then fly from there abroad. Does that make a difference how they get here for TPS or asylum? Okay, well, first let me say they would not be eligible for TPS because you had to be in the United States before March 15th. As far as applying for asylum, There aren't a lot of flights coming in from Russia that are allowed into the United States at this point, if any. So I can't see them using their passport to get on a plane in Russia that would bring them into the United States unless they have a visa that allows them to come into the United States. And I don't see that happening. So is it possible they would come in like other people are doing? They fly to Mexico and they arrive at the US border and they ask for asylum at the US border. They could do that. It would be defensive asylum and they potentially could be detained. It's unlikely, but they could be. There's also an explanation in there about the situation in Ukraine, which I don't know is part of the question. You cannot go to Ukraine and only allowed to be so-called evacuated to Russia and not UK. In what status can my parents or quad? I mean, you can petition for your parents to be processed on a family-based visa. If you're over 21 and a US citizen, you can petition for them to go through a US embassy. But again, there's a wait. They're going to be in a place they're not familiar with for some time and will have to be able to survive there. So whether that's Frankfurt, Germany or somewhere else, I mean, that's how it works as far as getting to the US. And I think that the US is to blame for some of that misinformation. They certainly changed things during the Afghan evacuation for a very short window of time that may have given some false hope to a lot of people around the world. My daughter, her husband, oh no, I've already done that one. I already got that.
Excuse me, I have a
yes.
follow-up question on
Yes.
what you just said about family-based petition. And the question is there a way that they can fly in on not an immigrant visa, but like a tourist visa, which is much easier to get, I think, and change their status, adjustment of status here? And again, we're talking about parents which are currently live in Ukraine, and they would go to Frankfurt, as I understand, and they would, you're saying that we have to apply for I-130 and they would have to wait. Is there instead of a different way of doing it if they apply for a different type of visa, like basically a tourist visa, and can they adjust the status while they are here in the United States?
Okay, so please understand, when you're asking for a tourist visa or what we call the B1, B2, it is temporary. You are promising the United States that you are going to leave, that you are only coming in for a short time, no more than 6 months at a time. So the US does frown on people who misrepresent their intention by applying for a tourist visa, then go to the US and immediately file for adjustment of status. There does have to usually be some sort of a waiting period. Whether or not you are approved for a tourist visa is actually not as easy as you might think. You have to have incredibly strong ties to your home country, which assures the United States that you're planning to leave. If you are in basically a displaced situation or a refugee situation to begin with, and you apply for a tourist visa to the United States, it's probably going to be denied, because they're going to think, well, you're not planning to come back here to the country that's not your home country, and you can't go to the other one. So in all likelihood, they would encourage you to acquire refugee status and to process that way, or to have their relatives in the United States submit the I-130 petition for them and process as what they actually are, relatives who wish to reside in the United States. So
Thank you.
just be aware of that. The tourist visa is getting harder and harder to get. Let's see. Yeah.
But if the person already just was granted just for the multi-year visa, and they cross the borders, and then right now they are in Romania, Moldova, then those visas, the old visas that were granted before it happened. So are they eligible to come to the United States, or their visas will also be denied in the courts?
No, if you have a valid visa to enter the United States, valid in the sense of it has not expired, you have not violated any previous stays, like you overstayed previously. But be aware of something. Since the creation of the Patriot Act after 9/11, that created our Department of Homeland Security. And Department of Homeland Security entails Customs and Border Patrol. So when you go through passport control at an airport, those officers, they have something called summary exclusion power. And they can, even though you have a valid visa, they can deny entry because they don't think you're going to stay temporarily, because I've had a client back when I had a private practice who showed up on Christmas Eve, and that was from Sweden, and she had a lot of luggage. It was winter, she had a lot of luggage, and she was denied entry. So
Does it mean that this is completely at their discretion to deny?
It
or
is.
not to deny?
it is their discretion, summary exclusion power. If you show up with a visa to come in, that's where they get the questions like, what are you here for? What are you planning to do? And, if somebody has the right answers, it's like, well, I'm coming here, I'm going to stay with my family, hoping things, kind of calm down there. And if they don't, I have somewhere else I can go. And what if they have the right answers, that may not be a problem for them. But it is a chance, and people do need to be aware of that. We're not as welcoming of a country as we like to think we are, or we historically have been, even in a crisis.
Mhm.
Okay.
And it was, once again, how it was called, summary exclusion
Power.
power.
Mhm. It's just there, just call it discretion for. Mhm.
Она больше рассказывает то,
Нет,
что,
нет, она все.
то, что здесь происходит.
I mean, it should be used for, anti-terrorism, but, obviously they use it however they want to use it. What are the chances of someone from Kiev getting a travel visa? I'm assuming that means like a tourist visa. Would the US consider them a risk that they might want to stay here? Yes. And how long would the visa process take? So you're not going to be able to apply for that tourist visa in Kiev. You're probably not going to be able to apply for it in the other nearby countries, possibly in Germany. I would say your best chances are applying
Только можно Франкфурт на Майне.
maybe another part of Europe or
Можно
something
там
like
будет
that
подавать.
and asking for it. But I think that's going to be flagged. If you're from Ukraine, there's definitely going to be a little bit more, might be a little more intense interview.
Они выдают эту визу, то они берут расписку, допустим, написано, да, что они вот в такое-то время вернутся.
Да, да, это да.
Okay, make sure to turn off your microphone. Okay.
Again, all the questions from the chat. There are more questions in the chat. That was from Alexander. As a U.S. citizen, can I contact them?
Question.
I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
I actually talked before about my father who is in Germany.
Mhm.
And you recommended to start with Form I-30, 130, which I will do, but it says that the filing of approval of this petition does not give any relative any immigration status or benefit. So if my father comes here, will he be eligible for any kind of medical or kind of help, or I will have to be his full financial kind of assistance? I will have to give him myself.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question, but let me go over that again. So the I-130, remember, this is a two-part process when you petition for your immediate relative, and it begins with the I-130 that goes to USCIS. Think of that as the first part of it is done in the United States, and they are just trying to establish that this is a legitimate relationship, and therefore they can approve it And all that means is we're now going to send this to the National Visa Center, which is under our State Department, to process through a US consulate. And it is after being processed through that US consulate, let's say in Frankfurt, and your father is approved, he would enter the United States as a lawful permanent resident. Okay, so think of it as two parts. The first part is just, yes, the government is willing to entertain your request. And think of the second part as, okay, can this person now be allowed into the US? But he would come in as a lawful permanent resident, and lawful permanent residents, you must sponsor, you must show that you can sponsor, because there is no guarantee that they would receive benefits right away. So you have to show appropriate income and ability to sponsor them. But that's the second part of it. And we have our phone number listed in, I think, on the slides, but also in the flyers that we have. And what you would want to do, if there is something, if you're ready to go forward with some sort of application process, you will want to call our office. You'll speak with our legal assistant, Claudia, primarily, and schedule an intake. You'll be asked some questions initially. There's sort of a screening document that we use. And then you would be scheduled for a consultation. It's usually going to be with me. And it's going to go more in depth. We're going to cover a lot of different things. And then we will let you know if we are able to assist. We are not public defenders, so we do not take every case just because there is a financial need. We are looking for cases where there's something we can actually do. So keep that in mind, but we're happy to have those consultations to give you advice and to give you guidance. Even if we don't take the case, we will give the legal advice and guidance to the best of our ability.
Okay, so should I ask for your help with consultation after my father is here, or before I even start the process?
Based on our conversation, I would suggest you contact our office and schedule a intake with me.
Okay.
And we can go over it, because there's stuff that every case is different. No matter how much you think they're the same, they're not. Yeah. And so it's really important for me to ask you certain questions to try to really flesh this out better so I can properly advise you. That's the job of any attorney, is to explain to a potential client all the possible outcomes. So I would ask that you schedule that appointment, and that way we can get into much more personal details, okay?
Yeah, thank you. And the phone number is in the chat, right? Okay.
It is. It's right
Great.
there.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Are there any other questions? Okay.
I have a question. So my parents-in-law, they're older, 78 and 87. They fled Ukraine and they are currently in Germany. I have emailed Frankfurt US Embassy, and they have told me that my husband can file I-130 for them. And if my husband appears with his parents at the embassy, they can basically schedule an interview a week from now and get everything done and approved. Does that sound right, or
no.
should I? No,
sure doesn't. The first part of that is correct. Your husband, as their child, is the one. You could not petition for them. You will have some part of the affidavit of support, but I don't want to get into that. Yeah. He would be the one to submit the I-130 petition, but again, that does not go to the embassy at all. That goes to USCIS, and after they have approved the I-130, they would then transfer the case to the National Visa Center, which would then eventually create that pathway to an interview at the US Embassy, designated in the application where they want to be interviewed. So in the I-130 application, all the way back at there, you're saying this is where I want to be interviewed. It's going to be Frankfurt, Germany. So the other part, the second half of that, no, it sounds absolutely, If you
That
have
is
that
the
in writing
official
for them,
email that I
send it to me.
received.
I-
That's the official email that I received. I can
I don't, yeah.
share
that doesn't
it
sound
with
right at
you,
all.
you know, for the benefit of other people, but I just wanted to make sure that's the right process. It sounds like it may not be.
I don't know how they could say that. First of all, no one else is allowed into those interviews. You don't get to bring in the petitioner to that interview. That's done only with an officer and the applicant, the beneficiary of that application. So that's the first part that I find suspect. The second part is to say, if he shows up, we'll get it done and I'll be done in a week. That doesn't, again, I don't know why they would ever say that. So I have some serious concerns about that. I don't know if there's been something created that looks like the embassy page or somehow someone hacked it. I won't be shocked about that, but I can tell you that I've been doing this for a long time and that has never happened. I've never seen that happen.
No, I think what they're saying is because of that situation crisis in Ukraine, they are expediting things. They're not changing the process. They're just expediting it.
I don't know how they can expedite it because they're going to be overwhelmed with applications.
Don't know.
I mean, that might be a lofty goal, but you know, that was a rumor that went around when we dealt with the Afghan crisis. You know, oh, the things are going to go extra fast and things are going to be done. And there was some approvals done quickly, but consular processing did not speed up at all. It stayed exactly, it became slower because there were so many applications.
Okay.
I mean, they are human beings that have to make these decisions. I don't know how you can get through triple vetting in a week. Triple vetting with the CIA and Interpol and other agencies, that's not possible in a week. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure if maybe they, I provided additional details, maybe because they're older, 78 and 87, they made an exception. I don't know, but I will definitely follow up with them.
I would suggest you speak with an immigration attorney before you submit any applications. And all I can tell you is I've never heard of that. I certainly would know about that as I am constantly receiving notices from the Immigration Court, from Department of Homeland Security, from American Immigration Lawyers Association. I can just tell you that does not sound correct to me. And I don't know how anything could be expedited to that point. And age does not matter when it comes to the background check. And again, it's a two-part process. So the I-130 would never go to the US Embassy. It would go to USCIS, and you'd have to wait for them to approve it before it even started with the National Visa Center.
All right, I will reach out to you. Maybe I will share the details of my case.
Okay, that sounds
Thank
good.
you.
Thank you. Any other questions?
You mentioned people like CIA, sorry, then Interpol and the third agency, USCIS.
No, for the vetting, the background checks that are done overseas, it's now called triple, FBI is involved too. It's now called triple vetting. The embassy itself can investigate, can go out, and usually it's because, you know, everything is there. So they have officers who can go and show up at somebody's house to make sure they are who they are. But the triple vetting now is done through security agencies. Mm-hmm. All right.
Thank you so much for everyone who joined us. If you want more information, Katie, are you able to mute one of the mics? We're echoing. I just want to say thank you for joining us. I think there's a shared sense of frustration at the complexity of the process and the timing, to say the least. I think if there are, and I'm sure there will be more questions, the Immigrant and Refugee Law Center is welcoming them from you. If you didn't see the number in the chat, it's 513-828-0577, and they can consult with you and give you a chance, give you more specific information about your personal situation and your loved ones and some of these logistics. And as we learn more, we will promote other opportunities to convene this way. And, if there's opportunities to help in other ways, we'll continue to reach out. So thank you for being here. I wish we had better, news to share. What we all want to hear is everyone can fly over here tomorrow. And it's become clear to me that it's much more difficult than that. So I hope this was helpful, and I wish you all the best and a happy weekend, and good luck with all of this. Thank you.
Ничего они не убыстрили, ничего. А этот